I want to be clear about something before I start. I am not the kind of person who tells stories like this. I spent 4 years as a wildland firefighter, working the Cascades and the Bitterroots. After that, 2 years on trail crew in Olympic National Forest, building drainage switchbacks in the rain, and learning to read terrain the way you read a face, looking for where the pressure is going, where the seams are. After that, search and rescue with a joint unit out of Wenatchee. I coordinated recoveries in zero visibility snowpack. I have written incident reports for subjects found in conditions that do not photograph well. I have worked inside the official language of federal land management long enough to understand that the language exists, at least partly, to make sure no one has to say clearly what they found. I tell you this, not to establish credentials. I tell you this because I want you to understand what it means when I say that I am telling you this story in direct violation of a written instruction I received on my first day of assignment at Great Smoky Mountains National Park. The instruction is not complicated. It says, "Do not discuss operational observations from the Noland Divide patrol corridor with anyone outside the Park Service chain of command in any format, including informal conversation." I am choosing to violate it. I need you to understand the weight of that choice for someone with my professional background. Written instructions exist because someone made the calculation that the instruction was necessary. Breaking a written instruction means deciding your judgment is better than that calculation. I have made that decision exactly once before in my career. The outcome of that decision is part of why I ended up on Noland Divide in the first place. So, you know what I am risking by speaking. You know what kind of person I am. Now I'll start where it actually started, with a drive up a mountain road I'd never driven before, and a supervisor who handed me a laminated card before he told me where the bathrooms were. Before any of that, though, there is one thing I need you to carry through everything I'm about to tell you. The rules on that laminated card were not written to control behavior. They were not written by a committee or generated from a risk assessment template or pulled from a comparable parks protocol database. I have read enough institutional documentation in my career to recognize the fingerprints of those processes, and those fingerprints are not on this document. The rules on that card were written to document outcomes. Someone had already made every mistake those rules prohibit. Someone had responded to the name called from the drainage. Someone had arrived at campsite 67 in the wrong sequence. Someone had kept moving when the fog went east. Someone had counted the register number aloud. Those people made those mistakes, and the mistakes produced outcomes. And whoever survived those outcomes wrote down what they learned and handed it to the next person and said, "These are the rules now." I understood this by day 4. I understood it intellectually by the end of day 1, the way you understand the temperature of fire by reading the number on a thermometer. But understanding something intellectually and understanding it in your body, those are different processes with different timelines. By day 4, I understood it in my body. I wish I had understood it that way on day 1. What the rules are protecting against, I cannot name it accurately. I've tried. My SAR training gives me a framework for classification: subject, terrain, hazard, contributing factors. I can fill in 3 of those 4. The middle one will not stay still. Every time I think I have isolated it, it changes shape on me. What I can tell you is that the park's official incident reports for the Noland Divide corridor do not name it either, and those reports go back 40 years. The absence is not an oversight. The absence is a choice. Whatever it is, it was there before the reports. It will be there after them. The drive took 4 hours from Asheville. The last 40 minutes were on a road that wasn't on any mapping app I'd ever used, which should have told me something. The Forest Service road that feeds the Noland Divide trailhead is not on Google Maps. It is not on any of the 3 offline mapping applications I had loaded on my phone before the drive. I found it because Wes had included a hand-drawn sketch in the employment packet, a small, precise diagram of the turnoff from the main park road, with the notation, odometer, 2.3 miles, left at the second gap in the guardrail, not the first. It took me 3 pass-throughs to find the second gap. The road that opened up behind it was packed gravel, narrow, with a tree canopy close enough on both sides that my side mirrors tracked through the lower branches for the first quarter mile. My GPS loaded a spinning recalculation wheel at the turnoff and kept it there for the rest of the drive. Not no signal, not error, just the wheel, spinning, as if the application was still working on the problem and declining to admit it couldn't solve it. The ridge appeared when the road climbed above the second switchback. I pulled over without intending to and looked at it through the windshield for a moment. Noland Divide is narrower than you'd expect from the topographic maps. The maps give you the numbers: 3,200 feet at the southern terminus, climbing to nearly 5,500 at the north end, where the divide approaches the Appalachian Trail corridor. But numbers don't prepare you for the physical reality of a ridge that the drainage systems have scoured thin from both sides over 10,000 years. From below, it looks less like a mountain feature and more like something that has been reduced. The fog that morning was sitting directly on the ridgeline in a band about 30 feet deep, level and motionless, not forming from the air around it or dissipating into the sky above it. Just sitting, placed. I stepped out of the truck at the trailhead to get my pack, and the silence came down on me like a physical object. Not the absence of city sound, which I was accustomed to. Not even backcountry quiet, which I was very accustomed to. This was different. This was the sound of a space where sound was being managed the way a room sounds when the walls have been specifically treated to prevent echo, where the air feels slightly thick in the ear canals. I stood with my hand on the truck door and listened to it for a moment. I could hear my own breathing. I could hear the creak of my pack frame settling. I could not hear a single bird, though it was 6:45 in the morning in an old-growth forest in late spring. I told myself the fog was suppressing ambient sound. I believed about half of that. The station was a 10-minute hike from where I parked. My supervisor was waiting at the door. He'd been there long enough that the coffee he was holding had gone cold. His name was Wes Beaumont, and he looked exactly like 15 years of Noland Divide patrol looks on a person. He was around 50, compact in the way of men who have spent a long time moving through terrain where being compact is a practical advantage. Nothing carried that wasn't necessary. No gesture extended further than it needed to go. He had gray-brown hair that he'd cut himself recently, and not quite well. And his uniform was clean, but had the specific quality of fabric that has been washed 500 times. Still its original color, but without any memory of stiffness. He moved around the station the way people move in spaces they know with their eyes closed, without looking for things, finding them. He shook my hand once and gave me the tour in 11 minutes. I counted, because counting is something I do. Equipment cache, bear spray, trauma kit, extra batteries, weather radio mounted to the wall above the stove, patrol log, current binder in the left cabinet, completed logs on the shelf above it. Emergency protocol binder, right cabinet, orange cover. Satellite communicator, on its charging cradle by the door. Check it before every patrol. Check-in windows at 6 a.m. and 6 p.m. with the district office. He said all of this without looking at me, showing me the physical location of each item, the way you show a new employee where the supply closet is, with the assumption that the information is obvious to anyone qualified to receive it. He did not show me the laminated card. He made us both coffee from a kettle on the propane stove and set my mug on the table in front of me and sat down across from it. He drank his coffee, looking out the small window above the sink toward the ridgeline. The fog was still doing what it had been doing at the trailhead. Sitting, motionless, not behaving the way fog normally behaves at this time of morning. Then he looked at me directly. "Do you follow instructions well?" he said, "when you don't understand the reason for them?" Not a question exactly in his delivery. A question in its grammatical structure, but delivered flat, the way you might read an address off a piece of paper as information rather than inquiry. I told him I did. I gave him my professional framing for it, the SAR language around operational protocol and command hierarchy, and the necessity of individual compliance in a coordinated response system. He listened to all of it. He nodded once when I finished, the single nod of someone who has heard a correct answer and is recording that it was given, not celebrating it. He went to the cabinet above the stove and came back with a piece of laminated paper. He set it on the table between us and let me read it without saying anything. The card was printed on standard paper, laminated in a sleeve that had yellowed at the edges. It had been handled enough that the lamination was starting to separate at one corner. The font was Times New Roman. There was no header, no issuing authority, no date. Just 7 numbered items, single-spaced, centered on the page. I read them once, then I read them again. Then I set the card down and looked at Wes and asked whether this was standard issue for all backcountry stations in the park. He said no. I asked who had written it. He said it was compiled from several sources over a period of approximately 30 years. I turned the card over. The back was blank. I turned it back over and looked at Rule 3, again the instruction to sit down in the middle of a trail when the fog moved east and wait without using any electronic device until the fog reversed or until I could see 15 feet of trail in both directions. I thought about the specific operational circumstances in which sitting down in the middle of a trail would be the superior choice over shelter or descent. I asked what compiled from several sources meant in this context. Wes finished his coffee. He rinsed the cup at the small sink, placed it upside down on the drying rack, and turned around and said, "Memorize the card before you sleep tonight. I'll take it back when you're done. Patrol starts at 6. He picked up his pack from next to the door and went outside, and I heard his boots on the step, and then on the gravel. And then, nothing. I sat at the table with the laminated card and the cooling coffee. The fog through the window was still sitting on the ridge, the way it had been when I arrived. The weather radio on the wall gave a soft crackle of static, and then went quiet. 7 rules. 7 completely specific, operationally detailed, professionally formatted rules that between them described a working environment I had no rational model for. I read them a third time, slowly, and I noted the specific points at which my attempts to construct a rational explanation failed. There were a lot of those points. I lay in the bunk that night, in a station that smelled like pine sap and old wood, and thought about Rule 7 for a long time before I fell asleep. Rule 1 says, if you hear your name spoken from below the ridgeline, from either drainage, do not respond. Do not turn toward the sound. Continue walking at your established pace for no fewer than 60 seconds before altering your direction for any reason. I lay in the dark and tried to build a rational framework for this rule. First attempt: acoustic misdirection. The ridge geometry on Noland Divide creates sound ducting effects. I knew this from the briefing documents. It was possible that voices from hikers in the Noland Creek drainage could appear to originate from the deep creek side, and that a ranger responding to a voice might inadvertently travel in the wrong direction. Rule 1 could be a correction for this maintain course. Don't react to the apparent source. Give yourself 60 seconds of stable direction before adjusting. This almost worked. Then I looked at the specific wording again. Do not respond. Do not turn toward the sound. Not do not alter course immediately. Not verify direction before responding. Do not respond at all. Do not turn. The prohibition is on reaction, not on navigation error. That's a different kind of rule. Second attempt: protocol for unauthorized visitors attempting to lure rangers off trail. Some backcountry areas had problems with this. If someone wanted to steal from a ranger cache or avoid permit verification, calling out to the ranger and drawing them into a drainage while Confederates worked the trail was not impossible. The 60-second rule prevents a reactive departure from the patrol path. This also almost worked for about 30 seconds. Then I noticed that the rule specifies both drainages, east and west. If the concern was unauthorized visitors, you'd address the most accessible drainage. You wouldn't write a bilateral prohibition. You'd write a situational one. Third attempt: wildlife management protocol for specific predators that use vocalization to orient prey. Some large predators are documented to use sound in ways that manipulate prey movement. A protocol to prevent a ranger from moving toward an unusual sound in a wilderness area was not by itself unreasonable. except that no predator in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park speaks in a human voice. No predator speaks a person's name. No predator has had a new employee's name for less than 12 hours and uses it in the specific conversational register that Rule 1 implies. The 60-second specification. Someone measured this. Someone stood on that trail, heard their name, and discovered that the threat, whatever it was, required 60 seconds to resolve. Someone counted, while everything in them screamed to turn. That number was then recorded, compiled, and laminated. I wrote Rule 1 in my field notebook with a question mark beside it, and moved to Rule 2. Rule 2. Campsite 67 must be checked last on every patrol sequence, regardless of trail efficiency. I had trail efficiency hammered into me as an operational value from my second week of trail crew. Time on remote patrol is the scarcest resource in backcountry management. A rule that explicitly sacrifices it for sequence implied that sequence produced a different result than efficiency. And I could not build a rational model for that. The result was different how? Different for the campsite, or different for the ranger? I wrote the question mark. I moved to Rule 3. Rule 3 was the one that had kept me awake. Sit down. Not shelter. Not turn back. Sit down on the trail. In my SAR training, we had one protocol for weather deterioration, and it was movement. Get the subject moving. Get yourself moving. Change elevation. Stillness was a last resort, a survival positioned measure when movement was no longer viable. A rule that prescribed sitting down as the primary response to a weather condition was a rule written by someone for whom the normal relationship between movement and safety had been reversed. The instruction to not use any electronic device was a specific additional prohibition, not a general note about battery conservation, but a direct operational order. Whatever the east-moving fog was, it could apparently detect, or was affected by, electronic devices. I wrote the question mark. Rules 4 through 6 were worse. Not because they were stranger, though they were, but because they were more specific. And specificity in a document like this only comes from one thing: someone watching carefully enough to measure it. Rule 4. Do not count the trail register entries at campsite 54 aloud. Record the number in your patrol log using only written notation. If the number does not match the active permit total for that zone, do not make radio contact. Return to station and report in person. My entire professional framework rests on accurate verbal documentation. SAR operations run on voice radio traffic, verbal confirmation, spoken counts, and coordinates. The idea that the act of saying a number aloud could produce a different operational result than writing the same number was outside any model I had for how information worked. But the rule was not concerned with information. It was concerned with the act of speaking. The radio prohibition was specific. Don't transmit the number. Don't vocalize it. Do not put it into the air in this location, via your own voice, or via an electromagnetic signal, until you are somewhere else entirely. Something could hear it. That was the only construction that fit. Something in the vicinity of campsite 54 could hear a spoken number and would respond differently to a wrong count if that wrong count was spoken rather than written. I sat with this for a long time. I could not make it fit a rational model. I wrote it down anyway, in my field notebook, in writing, not aloud. Rule 5. If a hiker reports seeing a ranger on the trail ahead of you, acknowledge the report and note the physical description. Do not confirm or deny that a second ranger is on patrol. Complete your check-in at the end of the patrol, regardless of what the description contains. This rule assumes, as a baseline operational fact, that hikers will report seeing a ranger who is not there. It treats this as a normal enough occurrence to have written a handling protocol for it. The instruction to neither confirm nor deny is not diplomatic hedging. It is a genuine operational instruction, because the Park Service itself appears not to know whether there is or is not a second ranger on the trail at any given moment. The rule does not say there is no second ranger. It says, don't commit either way. Don't tell the hiker they didn't see what they saw. Don't tell them they did. Just note the description and finish the patrol. I thought about the physical description element. Why note it? What use was a description of someone who might not exist? Unless the description, over multiple reports from multiple hikers, began to converge on a specific individual. Unless the Park Service was building a profile. Unless the note-taking was the point. Rule 6. Between the half-mile marker and the 1.2-mile marker, north of the station, the quiet zone, speak only to hikers who speak first. Do not initiate conversation. If you need to communicate urgent information, write it on your notepad and show it. Do not raise your voice for any reason. This was the rule that made the others coherent. 3 of the first 6 rules were concerned with the specific character of speech. Whether you speak at all, whether you speak aloud or in writing, whether you initiate or respond. They were not about sound level. They were not about noise discipline in a wildlife observation area. They were about the nature of vocal initiation itself. Speaking first, in this location, changed something. It announced something. It created a condition that responding to existing speech did not create. In the quiet zone specifically, and in other conditions elsewhere on the trail, initiating vocalization was operationally different from responding to it. Something was orienting to the sound of a deliberate human speech, and it could tell the difference between speech that began an exchange and speech that continued one. And then there was Rule 7. Rule 7. At the end of every patrol, before signing the station log, sit outside the station door and wait for 5 minutes. If, during those 5 minutes, you hear any sound from the Noland Creek side that you cannot identify any sound at all, go inside, sign the log, and do not come back out until morning. This applies regardless of any sounds, voices, requests, or apparent emergencies occurring outside. I read the final clause 3 times, regardless of any apparent emergencies occurring outside. I thought about the specific decision-making process that produces language like that. You do not write, regardless of apparent emergencies, unless you have encountered the situation where the apparent emergency was both genuinely compelling and definitively not real. You write it because someone before you heard something that sounded exactly like an emergency, evaluated it using every professional framework they had, concluded that it was real, and went outside to respond. And whoever wrote this rule decided that outcome was not something they wanted repeated. The 5-minute window was the terminal rule because it governed the moment of maximum vulnerability. End of patrol. Cognitive resources depleted. Physical fatigue compressing the margin between discipline and instinct. The thing, whatever it was, knew this. The rule assumed it would always be there at the end of patrol. It assumed the apparent emergency would come up from the Noland Creek drainage with regularity and specificity, and with enough detail that the compulsion to respond would be genuine. I lay in the bunk and thought about the kind of apparent emergency that a wilderness professional with SAR background and medical training would find genuinely compelling. I thought about what I would hear coming up from a dark drainage that would make me stand up from a doorstep and walk toward it, despite a laminated rule that said, "Don't." I had one answer, one specific answer that I had been carrying for 3 years. That was the actual reason I was lying in this bunk, in this station, on this ridge, instead of somewhere else. I thought about that answer for a long time. Then I turned over and looked at the ceiling and listened to the fog moving against the windows. And eventually, I slept. Morning came gray and wet, the fog sitting on the ridge like it had been waiting for something to start. I laced up my boots, checked my satellite communicator, and walked out the station door for my first patrol. The first thing that strikes you about backcountry patrol work, if you come from SAR, is the quiet procedural rhythm of it. SAR is reactive. A bell rings. You move. You adapt continuously to a situation that is changing faster than your information about it. Patrol is proactive and sequential. You move through a zone in a defined order, checking defined things, recording defined observations. The form of the work is a list, and the list proceeds whether or not anything interesting is happening. On my first patrol morning, nothing interesting was happening, and the list proceeded beautifully. Campsite 51. Empty, fire ring cold, bear box locked and undamaged. Campsite 52. 1 registered group of 2. Proper permits. Bear canisters inspected. No violations. 1 hiker with a new blister on her left heel that she'd already dressed correctly. I gave her the standard advice about mileage and boot tension and wrote the contact in my patrol log. Campsite 53. Empty. The trail through to 54 was soft from overnight dew, and my boots left clean prints in the dark soil along the edge where the mineral substrate came through the duff. Campsite 54. I checked the permit board first. 7 registered occupants across 2 groups in the zone. Both groups' permits current. Expiration dates correct. I walked to the trail register box mounted on the post near the bear boxes and opened the weathered wooden lid and read the entries. My lips were moving before I caught them. I stopped. I took a breath through my nose, counted the entries again in my head, wrote the number in my patrol log in clean numerals. The number matched the permitted total exactly. I closed the register box. I stood for a moment and looked at what I had written. 7. 7 permitted. 7 registered. Match confirmed. What unsettled me was not the count. The count was correct. What unsettled me was the automatic, professional reflex of the moving lips. I have documented hundreds of field counts in my career by murmuring the number under my breath, the way you do when you're tracking a running tally the way you've always done it, the way every ranger and SAR operator and trail crew lead I've ever worked with does it. I had come within half a syllable of speaking it aloud. In compliance with a rule I had mentally classified as irrational 24 hours earlier, without making a conscious decision to comply. The rule had already embedded itself in me before my training had processed it. I thought about that for a moment longer than was operationally necessary, and then I continued my patrol. The internal map labeled it with the simple notation: quiet zone, half-mile marker, north to 1.2, mile marker north. No footnote, no explanation of the designation, no parallel in any other backcountry zone documentation I had ever seen in any park system. Just the label and the implied instruction to treat the label as self-explanatory, which it wasn't. I entered it at the half-mile marker at approximately 10:15 in the morning. The transition was not abrupt. That's the thing I want to be precise about, because abrupt would suggest a specific event, a moment of crossing, and there was no such moment. It was a subtraction, gradual, cumulative. The way a room goes quiet when several conversations end in sequence rather than all at once. The bird calls thinned. The background insect noise dimmed. By the time I was fully inside the zone, perhaps 200 yards past the marker, the sound had not disappeared, but had reduced to the point where I was aware of its absence as an active condition rather than a neutral one. What replaced it was not silence. The wrong word for this location is silence. What I walked through for the next mile and 2/10 was something I have since come back to in my notes multiple times, trying to get the description accurate. The closest I can come is this: the forest was listening, not passive, not empty. Listening in the way a person listens when they have stopped moving and held their breath to hear something better. The canopy above the trail was old-growth hemlock and red oak and tulip poplar, the trunks massive and widely spaced. And in that interior, the air had a specific density to it. Cool, still, slightly pressurized, that made the inside of the zone feel enclosed in a way that open forest shouldn't feel. My breathing was audible. My boot soles on the trail surface were audible. The creak of my pack frame, the small metallic sound of my radio clipped to my chest strap. All of it seemed to carry further than it should have, not amplified, but present in a way that sound in open forest is not. Like the forest was a room with walls close enough to reflect. I moved through at standard patrol pace. I noted no hikers. I noted no wildlife. Not a squirrel, not a chipmunk, no raptors overhead in the canopy gaps. The trail surface was undisturbed. I reached the 1.2-mile marker and kept walking, and the sound returned over approximately 40 steps. Bird calls first, then insects, then wind in the upper canopy. Gradually, naturally, exactly as it had subtracted on the way in, but from the opposite direction. I stood at the edge of the zone's northern boundary for a moment and wrote, "Quiet zone, transit complete, 10:15 to 10:52. Ambient sound absent throughout. No wildlife activity, no unusual events, no hikers encountered." I paused over the words, "no unusual events," for a moment, then left them. They were accurate. Nothing had happened. Nothing had happened in a way that was very precise and very specific, and that my notes could not fully capture. Campsite 67 was last, as the rule required. Campsite 67 was empty in the early evening light. The fire ring was cold, the permit board blank, which matched the zone record. I checked the bear boxes, logged the site as unoccupied, stood in the center of the flat, cleared area, and looked at the angle of the light through the hemlock canopy, and thought about nothing in particular for a moment. Then I started back toward the station. I arrived at the door at 6:43. I stood on the step. I set my watch timer for 5 minutes and sat down on the wooden step and looked out toward the Noland Creek drainage to the west. The fog, all day, had been moving west, moving with the prevailing wind, well-behaved, meteorologically predictable. This was not the east-moving fog the rule described. This was normal fog, doing normal fog things. I noted this with a specific, quiet relief that I was slightly embarrassed by. I had been a backcountry ranger for one day. I was sitting on a step, feeling relieved about fog direction. I listened. I heard the drainage far below the sound of Noland Creek on rock, distant and continuous, the kind of white noise that forested creek valleys generate in late afternoon. I heard wind moving through the ridgeline canopy above the station. I heard once a barred owl from somewhere in the middle elevation of the western slope, beginning its call, the opening 2 notes of its standard phrase, and then stopping, not completing the phrase. The first 2 notes, and then nothing, as if the owl had been interrupted by something it hadn't expected to find. I waited. The owl did not finish the call. At 5 minutes, I went inside. I signed the log. I wrote my campsite notes. I made food on the propane stove and ate at the table and looked out the small window at the last of the evening light on the ridge and tried to determine whether the day had been normal or whether the day had been something else dressed in normal's clothes. In my field notebook, I wrote, Day 1. Rules observed, no incidents. I put the pen down. I looked at what I had written. Then I wrote, below it, 1 more line. Owl stopped mid-call, western drainage, 1848. No explanation. The second patrol started the way all second days start, with the confidence that you know the terrain now, that you've done it once, and that makes it knowable. I was wrong about that. It was the second patrol, midday, the trail running along the high spine of the divide with the deep creek drainage opening up below me to the east. A long, deep green slope dropping away into old growth cover, so dense the creek at the bottom was invisible, just a faint sound of water if the wind cooperated. I was moving north, about 2 miles above the station, checking my GPS track against the paper map out of habit. The fog was west, well west, and the morning had been clear and uneventful. 2 groups contacted, both in compliance. Register at 54, correct, logged in writing, lips closed. Then I heard my name, not shouted. That's the thing I keep coming back to. The detail I've gone over more times than I can count. Not shouted, not called in the carrying voice of someone trying to reach a ranger across a drainage. Spoken, at the conversational volume you'd use across a kitchen table. Daniel. My full first name, not a nickname, not a title. Just Daniel. From below the ridgeline, from the deep creek side, from somewhere in the deep green slope that dropped away to my east. My body turned before my mind caught it. I had rotated approximately 10 degrees to the right before the rule surfaced and locked my feet. Do not respond. Do not turn toward the sound. Continue walking at your established pace for no fewer than 60 seconds before altering your direction for any reason. I did not continue walking. I couldn't make that work. My legs had locked with the rest of me. But I did not turn further. I stopped my rotation at 10 degrees and held there, looking at the northern trail ahead of me rather than at the slope, and I started counting. The 60 seconds were the longest I have spent in any field environment in my career, including the night I spent on a canyon shelf in the Cascades in a storm waiting for evac. In the cold and the wind and the wet that night, time had a reason to move slowly. On the Noland Divide trail in bright midday sun, with my name hanging in the air from a drainage where no one should have been within conversational distance of me, time did something different. It didn't slow. It thickened. Each second was the same duration, but had more in it. More surface area, more weight, I counted. I kept my hands loose at my sides because balling them into fists would have told my adrenal system something I didn't want it to hear. I breathed through my nose at the pace I had been breathing before I heard my name. My pack weight was familiar on my shoulders. The trail surface under my boots was real and solid. The normal smell of warm forest wet soil, resin, the faint sweetness of something flowering below was still present. I counted, and I held still, and the voice did not repeat. At 60, I turned. There was nothing below the ridgeline in the direction the voice had come from. I looked at the slope for a full minute. The long sight lines between the old-growth trunks were clear. No movement, no color break that suggested a person. The terrain was open enough at that elevation that a person standing within conversational distance would have been visible. There was no person. I turned back to the trail. I looked at the trail surface where I had been standing during the 60-second count. The substrate along that section of Noland Divide is soft, a combination of decomposed organic matter and the fine mineral soil that the ridge produces where the bedrock is close to the surface, dark and friable and responsive to pressure. In 6 years of trail and SAR work, I have read ground surfaces the way other people read text. Animal prints, human prints, compression patterns from equipment drags, the specific distortion patterns of running versus walking versus crawling. I can read all of it. What I saw around the spot where I had been standing was not any of those things. In a rough semicircle around my last position, the soil surface was disturbed. Not with prints, nothing that resolved into a recognizable shape. With compression and displacement, the kind of pattern that material produces when weight has been applied to it from above at close range across a distributed area, not in discrete contact points. Like something had been very near me, oriented around me, present in the space immediately behind and beside me while I stood facing north. The disturbance was fresh. The edges were still sharp. The moisture in the displaced soil still dark against the drier material at the margins. This had not been there when I stopped. I had been standing on an undisturbed trail surface, when I heard my name. Whatever was in that semicircle of displaced earth had arrived while I was counting. It had come while I was facing away. It had been close enough that I should have been able to hear it arrive. I had heard nothing. It had arranged itself around me in the 60-second window. And then, when? When had it left? When I turned to look at the drainage, in the first seconds of my 60 count, before the displacement would have been complete. I photographed the disturbance from 4 angles. I measured the arc with my field tape, approximately 8 feet across, centered on where I had been standing. I documented everything in my personal field notebook without speaking any of it aloud. I did not put it in my official patrol log. The note I wrote was clinical. The handwriting was not quite steady. I finished the patrol. I checked the remaining campsites. I sat outside the station door for 5 minutes and listened to the Noland Creek drainage and heard nothing I could not identify. I went inside. I stood in the middle of the station for a long time before I sat down. And then I went to find Wes. The 3rd patrol started clean. Weather radio had called for fog clearing by 9, and by 8:30, the visibility on the ridgeline was 30 feet and improving. I ran the southern campsites without incident, noted a group of 4 at campsite 56 who were 2 days past their permit expiration, the standard non-confrontational compliance conversation, the standard apologetic response, the standard signed acknowledgement form. By 11, I was moving toward the quiet zone transit, with the fog thinning fast above the canopy, and the light starting to cut through in long shafts that made the old-growth interior look like something that belonged in a photograph. I found Carla Ostrowski at the junction spur below campsite 58, moving south at about half her probable normal pace. She was mid-50s, experienced gear-quality boots, technical pack frame, navigation tools clipped to the shoulder straps. But her movement pattern was wrong. Not injured wrong. Something subtler. She was placing her feet with slightly too much deliberateness, the compensatory attention of someone whose spatial processing is running a quarter second behind where it should be. Her eyes, when she looked up at my approach, were tracking correctly, but refocusing with a small lag that altitude and dehydration together produce in otherwise capable people. She had maybe an hour before the lag became a problem. My assessment took about 30 seconds. My plan was already forming. Walk her down to the lower campsites. Get elevation, undress, water, and rest. She was not in danger yet. She was on the approach to where alone became a problem. And I was here. And the solution was movement and descent. I started to tell her we were going to head down together. Then the fog turned. I caught it in my peripheral vision, the fog bank sitting above the Noland Creek drainage to the west, which had been receding all morning, suddenly stilled, then moved east against the wind, slowly, with the specific lateral drift of something navigating rather than being carried. Within 45 seconds, the visibility on the ridgeline had dropped from 30 feet to 8. The rule was in my head before I had finished recognizing what I was seeing. Rule 3. Stop walking. Sit down on the trail. Do not use any electronic device. Wait. I looked at Carla. I looked at the fog. I looked at my satellite communicator on its chest strap and thought about what "do not use any electronic device" meant in the context of a hiker with altitude symptoms who needed to be monitored. I thought about my medical training and the specific chart of altitude-related symptom progression, and where Carla currently was on that chart, and where she would be in 90 minutes if her condition moved in the wrong direction. Every piece of medical training I had said, keep her moving, get her down. Rule 3 said, sit down. I sat down on the trail. She looked at me the way people look at someone who has done something unexpected and slightly alarming. I told her to sit with me. I told her it was a weather protocol. I told her this was the correct thing to do. I believed about half of that. She sat. She had the adaptable quality of experienced backpackers who have learned that wilderness professionals sometimes do things that seem counterintuitive, and that the correct response is usually compliance first, questions later. I gave her water from my pack. I kept a light, professional conversation going where she'd come in, where she was heading, her timeline, standard distress management, the kind of talking that keeps someone's cognition engaged without requiring them to work for it. Her responses were slightly slow, but accurate and improving. The water was helping. I monitored her pupils when the fog allowed enough light, and noted normal constriction response. She was going to be all right if we waited. I told myself that in the specific internal voice I use for telling myself operational facts. She was going to be all right. Around us, in the fog, something moved. Not dramatically. I want to be precise about this, because the experience was not dramatic in the way horror is supposed to be dramatic. It was not a shape glimpsed at the margin of visibility. It was not a sound that I could categorize as a footstep or a branch breaking. It was the fog itself, the behavior of it moving in patterns that were inconsistent with air current, not directional, orbital, as if something was circling us at a range of about 15 feet, displacing the fog as it moved, too large for a deer and too deliberate for wind variation. I kept talking to Carla. I kept my voice level and my body still, and I watched the fog move in its wrong patterns, and I did not reach for my radio. At minute 24, Carla tilted her head slightly. "Do you hear that?" she said. I asked what she heard. She was quiet for a moment. "Breathing," she said. "Very slow and very big." I wrote in my notebook, "Subject independently reports auditory event consistent with large organism respiration. Range estimated 10 to 20 feet. Not visible in current visibility conditions. No movement by subject or ranger. Maintaining stillness per protocol." I tore the page out and held it so she could read it. She read it. She looked at me. She was frightened, but she was also the kind of frightened that experienced people get when they understand the situation and are choosing to trust the person managing it. She stayed still. The breathing continued. Slow, with a rhythm that had no counterpart in any animal I could name, not the cadence of a bear's respiration, or a deer's, or any predator I had encountered. Something else. Something with lungs large enough that each breath cycle was approximately 12 seconds from intake to exhale. I counted the cycles because counting is what I do when I need to stay calibrated. At minute 37, I checked my watch. the fog moved west. Not gradually, not with the slow recession of natural fog lift. At once, like a decision, the fog drew back from the ridgeline to the west, and the breathing stopped at the same moment, and the light came down through the canopy, and the trail surface was clear and visible, and there was nothing in the forest around us. Carla looked at me. I told her we could move now. That evening, I found Wes at the station in the hour before his scheduled return to the district office. He was packing his overnight kit with the efficient, minimal movements of someone who has done the same packing sequence hundreds of times. And he looked up when I came through the door with a specific, alert quality of someone who has been waiting to see what state the new ranger returns in. I put my pack down. I sat at the table. I told him what had happened on the second patrol, the name from the Deep Creek drainage, the 60-second count, the disturbance in the soil. He set down the shirt he was folding. I told him about the fog today, about Carla Ostrowski and the 37-minute wait, and the breathing she had heard, the breathing I had heard, the 12-second respiration cycle I had counted. He was quiet for a moment. The weather radio on the wall ran through its automated forecast in the background. Overnight lows, ridge wind speeds, precipitation probability. Then he said, "Good. You counted to 60. He said it with a flat, careful emphasis on the word counted that told me everything about the sentence he was not completing. He said it the way you say good when you've been waiting to find out whether this particular person was going to be the kind of person who counts or the kind of person who turns. And the relief in the word is directly proportional to how many times you've watched someone not count. I asked him directly, what is on Noland Divide that the rules are designed to manage? He picked up the shirt again. He looked at the window. You're asking the wrong question, he said. The rules don't manage it. The rules manage you. There's a difference. I asked what the difference produced. He didn't answer. He asked instead, who didn't count to 60? The words were out of my mouth before I had decided to say them. He set the shirt in his bag and zipped the bag closed. I'm not telling you to read the logs in the storage box under the bunk, he said, and I'm not telling you not to. He paused. But first, I want to tell you something about my second season, about what I saw in the quiet zone when I was 29 years old and made the mistake of saying hello first. He told it the way he told everything. Flat sentences, no dramatics, the specific vocal register of a person who made a long time ago the decision not to invest emotion in this particular story, because the emotion would make the story less accurate, not more. He was on patrol, second season, moving north through the quiet zone at about the same time of day as my transit had been. He was still in the early phase of his time on Noland Divide, still constructing rational frameworks, still measuring his observations against what he knew was possible. He had adapted well, he said. He was comfortable in the zone. He had learned to move through the silence without reacting to it. He saw a ranger ahead of him on the trail, about 40 yards, moving north, same direction, standard patrol pace. The uniform was right. Same issue as his own. Same fit and color and posture of someone carrying a full patrol pack. Wes's first thought was operational. Someone from the district had been assigned a check patrol without notifying him, which was irregular but not unheard of. He called out a greeting. Standard trail acknowledgement. "Hey, district patrol?" The kind of thing you'd say to a colleague on a shared trail. The figure stopped walking. It turned around. The face was Wes's face. Not similar. Not the uncanny doubling of a familial resemblance. His face, specifically and in detail. The specific way his features were arranged. The age he was at the time. The particular quality of expression his face settled into at rest, which he knew because he had a mirror. The figure was wearing his face with the neutral attention of a person who has turned because they heard their name and is looking back to see what is required. Wes stopped speaking. The figure looked at him for a moment with the specific quality he described as recognition without personhood. The eyes were tracking him. There was nothing behind them that corresponded to a self. Recognition, he said, the way a security camera recognizes motion. Not understanding it, just registering it, logging it, filing it. Then the figure turned north and continued walking at the same pace it had been keeping before. Wes walked south. He did not look back. He walked south without varying his pace, out of the quiet zone, down the trail, to the station. He has never initiated speech in the quiet zone again in 13 years. What I understood afterward, he said, finishing the last of his coffee, is that it used what I gave it. I spoke first. I gave it a sound to work from. It built something out of that sound. What it built was the nearest functional approximation it had of me. He rinsed his cup and turned around. If I'd stayed quiet, it wouldn't have had the material. He picked up his overnight bag. He went to his room. He said from the hallway, without turning, "There's a storage box under the bunk. I'm not telling you to read the logs in it. I'm not telling you not to. I sat at the table for a long time. Then I got on my knees and looked under the bunk. The storage box was a plastic equipment bin, the commercial-grade kind used in Park Service caches, gray, with a latching lid. Inside it were 11 patrol log notebooks, the standard issue composition book size, used by the Park Service before the switch to the current binder format. The earliest was dated 1984 on the inside cover. The most recent stopped in 2009, the year before Wes arrived. I read them in chronological order, sitting on the floor with the storage box between my knees and the station's single overhead light burning yellow above me. The early logs were completely standard. Campsite compliance notes, weather observations, wildlife sightings, trail condition reports. The rangers in the mid-1980s wrote in the efficient shorthand of people comfortable with the format, dense, precise, no wasted words. Reading them felt like reading any backcountry station's operational record from that period. Normal, thorough, institutional. The shift came in the late 1980s, and it came gradually. The entries began to shorten. Not through loss of thoroughness, the operational details remained complete. The shortening was in a different dimension. Descriptive language contracted. The logs became more careful, in the specific way that language becomes careful when a writer has decided that the words they are using are inadequate to what they are describing and have chosen precision over completeness. By 1989, every patrol log from the quiet zone contained the notation, "Quiet zone, transit uneventful." Every single entry. It appeared like a prayer, or like a breath held until it could be released. Transit uneventful. I got through. Nothing happened. I am filing this under nothing happened. By the mid-1990s, the anomaly entries appeared, written in the same controlled professional language as everything around them, embedded in the normal operational record, with no special formatting, no indication that the writer considered them to belong to a different category of observation. Auditory event, Deep Creek side, 1420 hours, followed protocol. No contact made. No elaboration. No description of the nature of the auditory event. Just followed protocol. Which meant the protocol had already existed, already been transmitted to this ranger, already been in use before this entry was written. I cross-referenced. Every anomaly entry I found across 11 notebooks, I traced backward to find its corresponding rule. Rule 1. 19 anomaly entries across 8 seasons, all filed as auditory event, with the drainage side noted. Rule 3. 11 entries noting directional fog, eastward with transit times, and wait durations, ranging from 12 minutes to 4 hours and 6 minutes. Rule 6. 7 entries from the quiet zone, all worded identically. Initiated contact, subject unresponsive, withdrew per protocol. 7 entries. 7 times a ranger had spoken first in the quiet zone and seen something that they then classified as subject unresponsive. The rules were not invented. They were accumulated. Each one had a body of evidence behind it that the rangers had written into the official log in language that was as accurate as they could make it and as minimal as they could make it. Because to say more would have been to say something the official format could not contain. Near the back of the 3rd notebook, I found Soto's entry. The entry was from June 2001. A ranger named Soto, handwriting neat and left-leaning, had written a standard Campsite 54 compliance note, and then, in the margin beside it, recorded what appeared to be a running register count. 7, crossed out, 9, crossed out, 6, crossed out, and then a sentence. Stopped counting. The number kept changing while I was in the campsite, left without a total. The next entry in the log was dated 2 days later. Different handwriting. A ranger whose name I couldn't fully read the first letter was a C, the rest compressed, had written, arrived at station to find it unoccupied. No sign of Ranger Soto's return since June 4th. Equipment cache intact. Patrol log last signed June 4th. Initiating contact with district office per missing personnel protocol. The entry after that was a single line. Search initiated. There was no further entry from the searchers. The log resumed with the next seasonal assignment's first entry, 4 months later. I went through the remaining notebooks methodically. I was looking for the same pattern and entry that stopped, followed by a new ranger noting the station unoccupied. I found it 4 times total across the 40 years. 4 rangers on the Noland Divide corridor had been listed as missing. 4 searches had been initiated. 4 times, the log had resumed with a new seasonal assignment rather than a return. I cross-referenced all 4 against the rules. The first, a ranger named Alderman in 1988, whose last entry mentioned turning toward a sound from the Deep Creek drainage. Rule 1. The second, Soto in 2001, whose number changed in the register. Rule 4. The third, a ranger in 1995, whose name I couldn't fully make out, whose last entry described moving the injured subject toward lower elevation during east-moving fog. Rule 3. The fourth, Hendrix. I found the notation in the last notebook in the box. I had been saving it because something about the smaller size and the water damage on the cover made me want to read the others first. I found the Hendrix entries, read them forward from the start of their season, and understood that I had been reading toward this the whole time. The notebook was small, pocket-sized, more personal than the standard issue composition books. The handwriting was different from the official log style, more fluid, more like someone writing for themselves than for a record. The entries had a quality of private thought in them that the other logs didn't have. Hendrix had been a thinker who wrote in order to process, not just to document. The early entries were good, careful, perceptive, the notes of someone paying close attention. Hendrix had noticed the acoustic strangeness of the divide within the first week, had written 2 full paragraphs about the physics of the ridge geometry and the sound ducting effects, genuinely trying to construct a model. By week 3, the rational models were coming apart. The entries were shorter, more compressed, a lot of question marks. The same question marks I'd been writing in my own notebook, taped to the inside back cover with aged, yellowing tape. There was a photograph. Standard Patrol Photo 3 Rangers, standing in front of the station. 1991, according to the date written on the back in pencil. Smiling in the practiced, mild way of people who don't particularly want their photograph taken, but are cooperating. 3 rangers, in a row, in front of the station door I had been walking through all week. In the background of the photograph, at the tree line, there was a 4th figure, in a ranger uniform, standing in the trees, at the margin of the photograph, facing toward the camera. Far enough back that the features were not clear, far enough forward that the uniform was identifiable, the posture upright, the orientation toward the camera unmistakable. I turned the photograph over. On the back, in handwriting, I didn't recognize, different from Hendrix's, different from the penciled date notation, precise and regular and formal, in a way the other writing in the notebooks wasn't someone had written, "Do not go back for the 4th one." The 4th one is not Hendrix anymore. I set the photograph down on the floor beside me. I read Hendrix's final entry, which I had been putting off reading because I already knew what it was going to say. It said, "Heard a voice I recognized. Stayed 5 minutes. It didn't stop. I am going to check on it. I know the rule. I know what the rule is for. I am going anyway, because some rules are wrong." The next entry was not Hendrix's handwriting. It was the first entry of the following seasonal assignment. Station found unoccupied. No sign of previous ranger. Search initiated. I put the photograph in my field notebook. I put the old logs back in the plastic bin and slid it under the bunk. I sat at the table until about 2 in the morning. Then I went to sleep because the patrol started at 6, and the rules didn't care about my sleep schedule. The 4th patrol started with a weather variable I hadn't planned for. A storm system from the southwest moved faster than the morning radio forecast had indicated. By 10:30, the cloud ceiling was dropping, and the pressure reading on my wrist altimeter was falling at the rate that precedes serious mountain weather. I had 2 southern campsites and the quiet zone transit, and 4 northern campsites between me and the station. And the weather window was compressing around me. I made a route decision. I adjusted my sequence to finish the southern campsites and the northern block before the storm closed the ridge, which meant hitting the northern campsites in order of proximity rather than in the standard assigned sequence. In practical terms, it meant arriving at campsite 67 second rather than last. I understood the rule. I made the calculation that a weather-driven route adjustment was a legitimate operational override. I walked the adjusted route. I arrived at campsite 67 at approximately 1:15 in the afternoon, with the first of the rain beginning to spot the trail surface. The campsite was occupied. 3 backpackers, 2 men and a woman, mid-30s, quality gear well used. The look of people who spend extended time in backcountry on a regular basis. They were set up efficiently, tents properly staked, food properly cached, fire ring undisturbed. I ran the standard compliance check. I asked for permits. They provided them. The permits were in order. The names matched. The dates were current. The zone number was correct. But the answers were wrong. Not wrong in any way I could isolate during the conversation. I ran the check. I got the correct responses. I noted the campsite as occupied with current permits. I marked the group as compliant. The conversation was normal. They were friendly in the distracted way of people who are in the middle of their own wilderness experience and find the permit check a minor administrative interruption. Everything was procedurally correct. It was on the trail back toward the station, about a quarter-mile north of 67, that it hit me. Every answer they had given me was exactly the answer I would have expected. Not just correct expected. The woman had said she'd come in on the Pole Road Creek connector, which is the standard approach. The taller man had said they were heading out on the Deep Creek side, which is the standard exit. Their permit expiration was 2 days out, which is the standard remaining duration when a ranger encounters a mid-trip group. They had mentioned a campsite they'd stayed at the previous night. That was the campsite a group on this route would logically have used. None of that was wrong. All of it was the exact distribution of information that a trained ranger would expect a compliant group to provide. Every response was a match to the template of a normal compliance interaction, not to the variable, slightly irregular, always slightly unexpected responses that actual hikers give when you talk to them. Actual hikers don't give you the expected answer. They give you their answer, which coincides with the expected one only approximately. These 3 had given me the template. I stopped on the trail in the starting rain and stood there with the specific, stomach-dropping quality of retroactive wrongness. The sensation of having been inside something and only recognizing its shape after you've left it. I made a note in my log. Campsite 67. 3 occupants. Permit verification inconclusive. Behavioral anomalies noted. And then, on the trail back toward the station, I met a man named Reardon. Reardon was hiking south on a day pack, trail running shoes, the setup of someone doing a fast out and back from the trailhead. He was moving well, and didn't look like he needed anything except to be past me on the trail. But he stopped when he saw the uniform. "Hey," he said, "there another ranger up ahead? Older guy?" I told him I was the only scheduled patrol today. He nodded, unconcerned. Passed him about a mile north of the quiet zone marker. He was heading north. Didn't say anything, just kind of nodded. He paused. Older uniform, kind of. Darker green, different collar. I thanked him and noted his description in my log and continued south. Per Rule 5, acknowledge the report. Note the physical description. Do not confirm or deny. I contacted 2 more groups in the next 40 minutes before reaching the station spur trail. The first group, a pair of through hikers who had been moving fast from the north, reported seeing a ranger about 2 miles south of the AT junction alone. Heading north, older style uniform. The second group, a family of 4, slower moving, reported seeing a ranger on the quiet zone trail, heading north about 3 hours earlier. Older uniform. Different shade of green from mine. Different collar configuration. 3 groups. 3 independent reports. Consistent physical description across all 3. A ranger in a uniform style I did not recognize, heading north on the Noland Divide trail in the hours ahead of my patrol. Back at the station, I pulled the Park Service uniform reference binder from the right cabinet. An operational reference document listing equipment and uniform specifications across service periods for this district. I found the uniform description section. The darker green uniform with the collar configuration all 3 groups had described was last issued in 1994, when the service transitioned to the current lighter color. I sat with the reference binder open on the table in front of me and looked at the photograph on the page, a 1991 patrol photo from a comparable station. 3 rangers in the field, same uniform as the one described. 3 rangers. I thought about the photograph in my field notebook, the one with the 4th figure at the tree line. That night, I sat outside the station door for the Rule 7 window. The fog had been eastward since mid-afternoon. I had not been moving when it turned. I was already at the station. I did not know if that made a difference. I sat for 5 minutes and listened and heard nothing I could not name. I went inside. I sat at the table. I thought about Hendrix, and I thought about the 3 hikers who answered exactly right. And I thought, tomorrow is the last patrol before Wes comes back. Tomorrow, I need to finish this clean. The final patrol before Wes's return, my 5th day on the Divide, began with the specific clarity of a morning after a weather system has passed through. The rain had been heavy overnight. The ridge scoured clean, and the morning air had the sharp, resin smell that old-growth forest produces after rain when the duff layer is saturated and the tree bark is wet and everything is releasing at once. I was inside the quiet zone at 10:40 when the fog turned. I saw it in my peripheral vision. First, the mist above the Noland Creek drainage beginning to thicken and advance rather than retreat. East, against the clearing post-storm wind. I stopped walking. I watched the fog bank for 30 seconds, waiting for a meteorological explanation that didn't come. Then I sat down on the trail. The silence in the quiet zone was different from any previous transit. On the previous 4 entries, the silence had been consistently present, consistently strange, and consistently passive, the quality of a space being very still and very attentive. What I sat in now was none of those things. The silence was active. There is no more precise word for it. The air around me had the specific weight and pressure of a space in which something very large is being very still, not because it is absent, but because it is waiting. I sat. I kept my hands on my thighs, open, not gripping anything. I breathed at a measured pace. I looked at the trail surface in front of me, and at the canopy above, and at the fog rolling slowly in from the west, and I did not use any electronic device, and I did not speak. The minutes went by with the same thickened quality that the 60-second count had on day 2. More weight per unit of time. At minute 17, the fog had not turned. At minute 22, the fog had not turned, and the visibility on the trail was down to 6 feet in either direction. Then I heard footsteps from the north. 3 hikers emerged from the fog at about 20 feet, moving south. A man and 2 women, full overnight packs, headlamps mounted and lit against the fog despite the midday hour. They nearly walked into me before the front hiker saw my uniform and stopped. He started to say something. I held up my hand, flat palm. Stop. The universal signal. He stopped. I pulled my notepad from my chest pocket. I wrote, quickly, East Fog, rule stop protocol, do not speak, sit down now. I turned it toward them. The front hiker read it. His expression moved from startled to confused to cautious in about 3 seconds. He showed it to the woman behind him. She looked at me. I gestured down sit. She sat. He sat. The third hiker followed, watching the fog around them with the developing alertness of someone whose body is registering something her mind hasn't categorized yet. I wrote another note. Weather protocol. This section. Do not speak. Do not make sudden movement. This will pass. They sat. We all sat. Whatever was in the silence around us was present in a way it had not been present on the 37-minute wait with Carla. That had been a slow, circling awareness, something passing, something taking note. This was different. We were inside the quiet zone, in east-moving fog. 4 people sitting still in the specific, pressurized silence of something very near. The fog moved in patterns around us that had nothing to do with air current. At one point, the mist to my left condensed, and then drew back in a shape that suggested displacement. Not wind, not thermal. Something passing at close range. One of the women put her hand on her mouth. Her eyes were wide, looking to my left, at the place where the fog had displaced. She had seen it too. At 11 minutes, combined time of 33 minutes, sitting in the quiet zone. The fog turned west. The mist drew back from the ridgeline with the same sudden decisiveness I had seen on day 3, and the quiet zone's silence softened from active to passive. And then the first bird call came in from beyond the 1.2-mile marker, and then another, and the forest resumed. The front hiker let out a breath that he had been holding for a long time. The woman who had put her hand on her mouth lowered it. In a voice that was barely above a whisper, she said, "What was that breathing?" I wrote on my notepad, "Normal acoustic effect of this terrain." "You're okay." I held it toward her. She read it. She looked at me. She was smart enough to know what a written note in response to a spoken question meant, and what it meant about the limits of what I was going to tell her. She nodded once, accepting the transaction, and stood up. I wrote one final note. "Continue south. Do not stop before the half-mile marker. I will follow." I walked them out of the quiet zone to the southern boundary and watched them continue on the trail until they were out of sight. Then I turned north and finished the patrol. Campsite 54. Last stop before 67. I opened the register box. I read the entries without moving my lips. The active permit total for this zone on this date, 6 registered occupants. I counted the register entries. 13. I wrote 13 in my patrol log without speaking it. I closed the register box. I picked up my pack and started north towards 67. About 200 yards up the trail, I checked the number I had written. My handwriting was clear. The number I had written was not 13. I had written 13. I had watched my hand form the numeral. I had not spoken it. I had written it, closed the book, walked 200 yards, and the page now showed a different number, not 13. A number that was not 13. A number I was not going to speak aloud or write again here, in this account. Because I do not know whether the mechanism cares about format, and I am not going to test it. I stood on the trail for a moment. Then I continued north to campsite 67. The campsite was empty. No tents, no gear, no trace of occupation. The fire ring was cold and undisturbed, ash from weeks before. No fresh disturbance. The permit board was blank. I photographed every angle. I checked the soil surface for signs of recent camp setup, compressed tent footprints, food cache debris, the small scatters of organic material that people leave when they occupy a site. Nothing. Campsite 67 was as empty as if no one had been near it in weeks. I walked the 3 miles back to the station in the late afternoon light, the fog westward, the quiet zone silent in the normal ending way, passive, empty, just a section of old-growth trail with no birds. I sat outside the station door. I set my watch. 5 minutes. The Noland Creek drainage was dark below me, the light going from copper to gray in the hemlock canopy. The fog was west. Everything was as correct as it had ever been. At minute 3, something spoke from below the ridgeline. The voice was calm. That was the first thing, the specific quality of calm in it. Unhurried, conversational. The vocal register of someone speaking in a normal room to a person sitting nearby, not projecting across a drainage, not strained with distance or urgency. Calm, present, close. It said my name first. Daniel. Then it said, "I've been waiting. I know where you are." I have her voice in my memory, the way you have certain sensory information that arrives under specific conditions of stress and embeds itself permanently, not stored in the normal recallable way, but physically present, retrievable with the same full sensory detail as the original moment. I had not heard Patricia Orin's voice in 3 years. I had not sought recordings of it. I had made a deliberate professional effort, as part of my own post-incident management, to keep the specific sensory information of that deployment compartmentalized and accessible only when I needed to examine it deliberately, not when something triggered it reflexively. The voice from the Noland Creek drainage triggered it. Not approximately, not close enough to catch. Exactly. Patricia Oren was 43 when my SAR unit searched for her for 72 hours in the Cascades. She was found 11 days after we called the search, 100 yards from the last grid we worked, in terrain we had been through. The coroner's report said she had been alive for several days after the search was called. I had not stopped wondering about those several days, about what was happening in that 100 yards while we were filling out the closure paperwork. The voice from the drainage said, "You knew I was close. You knew." I was sitting on the wooden step outside the station door. My hand had found the door frame and was gripping it. I was aware of this without having decided to grip anything. My watch read 3 minutes and 12 seconds into the 5-minute window. "Please," the voice said, "I'm right here. I've always been right here." She used details I had never put in any report. Specific details from the search, things I had noted internally, things I had thought during those 72 hours that I had never spoken to anyone because they were unprofessional and specific, and mine. She used those details with the accuracy of someone who had been there, who had heard me thinking. I sat on the step, and I did not go. I gripped the door frame, and I counted not from any rule, just counting, because that is what I do when everything else is failing. I counted seconds. I counted up from 3 minutes and 12 seconds. At 5 minutes, I stood up, and I went inside, and I signed the log, and I sat down at the table. The old logs were still under the bunk where I had left them. I got on my knees and pulled the plastic bin out and opened it, and found the small, water-damaged notebook, Hendrick's notebook, and turned to the final entry. I had read it before. I read it again. Heard a voice I recognized. Stayed 5 minutes. It didn't stop. I am going to check on it. I know the rule. I know what the rule is for. I am going anyway, because some rules are wrong. The next entry, in a different hand, station found unoccupied. But I had not read carefully enough before. I had stopped at those 2 entries. I had not turned the page. The entry after the station found unoccupied notation was not a seasonal handover entry. It was a single sentence, in handwriting I had not seen in any of the other notebooks. Precise, regular, small. The script of someone with a formal education in a period when penmanship was still taught deliberately. Calm handwriting, unhurried. The handwriting of something that had time. It read, "He found me. He is finding you too. The 5 minutes are not enough. The 5 minutes were never the point. The point is what you do at minute 6. I closed the notebook. I set it on the table. The voice from the drainage had stopped when I went inside. The station was completely quiet. The weather radio on the wall gave its automated forecast. Outside, the Noland Creek drainage sat in the dark below the ridgeline, doing whatever it does in the dark below the ridgeline. I sat at the table with the notebook in front of me and thought about what the entry meant. The 5 minutes were not enough, which meant that 5 minutes of compliance were not the whole of what was being managed. The 5 minutes were the beginning of something, not the end of it. The first gate, not the last one. And at minute 6, the entry didn't say what happened at minute 6. It said that minute 6 was the point. The point of what? Of the window? Of Rule 7? Of everything the rules were protecting against? I sat until the light outside changed from black to gray. Wes arrived at the station at 8 the next morning. He looked at me. He said, "You stayed inside." I told him yes. He nodded once, slowly, and did not ask about the rest of it. I think he knew. I think he has always known, more than the laminated card says. I drove out that afternoon. I have been home for 6 weeks. This is the first time I have spoken about it. Home, in this context, is a third-floor apartment in Asheville, 20 minutes from the grocery store, and about 45 minutes from the park boundary. I have been here for 6 weeks. I am a normal person, living in a normal city, doing normal things. I know this because I check, periodically, and with the deliberate attention of a professional, and the evidence for normalcy is consistently present. But the rules came home with me. I don't mean this metaphorically. I mean it in the specific, behavioral, measurable sense. The rules have installed themselves into my daily pattern in ways I did not authorize, and am finding difficult to reverse. When someone calls my name in a crowd at the grocery store, on the street, in the lobby of my building, I do not turn immediately. My body executes a delay. About 4 seconds, not the full 60 of the rule, but a pause that is not normal, that people have noticed. A coworker at the part-time job I picked up after leaving the park assignment asked me last week if I was hard of hearing. I told her I was fine. I do not speak first in rooms where the acoustics feel wrong. Low ceilings, old walls, spaces with a quality of enclosure that reminds my nervous system of the quiet zone. I wait. I respond. I do not initiate. This makes certain social situations difficult. I am working on it. I am not making a lot of progress. Every morning, the first thing I do is look at the sky from my kitchen window and note the direction the clouds are moving. Every morning, before coffee, before checking my phone, before anything else, I note the direction, and I feel something that requires a moment to identify relief if it is west, and a small hardening of something in my chest if it is east. In Asheville, the dominant weather patterns run from west-southwest. Most mornings are fine. I do my errands in the same sequence every day. I have not adjusted for efficiency in 6 weeks. I told myself this was transitional behavior. The re-assimilation difficulty of someone coming off an intense wilderness assignment, temporarily defaulting to high-structure routine while the nervous system recalibrates. This is a real phenomenon. It has a name in the post-deployment psychological literature. I know, because I looked it up. I'm not convincing myself, quite. There's one more thing I haven't told you. The thing that made me decide to say any of this. The thing that happened 2 nights ago, Tuesday night, 11:15 p.m. I was at my kitchen table with a coffee that had gone cold, reading a trail survey report from the Olympic Peninsula, a planning document for a search corridor I was considering applying to work next spring. Normal professional reading. The window above the table was open 6 inches. The night was warm and still. One of those dense summer nights in the mountain city where the air barely moves and sounds from the street come up cleanly to the 3rd floor. From outside, from below, from the parking lot or the street level, a voice spoke my name at conversational volume. Daniel. I did not turn. My body attempted to, and I held it. I set the survey report down flat on the table and sat very still and kept my eyes on the kitchen wall in front of me, and I started counting. The voice spoke again. Not my name this time. The voice said, "It's cold out here. Come down." It was Wes Beaumont's voice, the specific vocal register of Wes Beaumont, the flat, minimal delivery, the voice of a man who has learned not to say more than necessary. Coming up from the parking lot of my apartment building in Asheville at 11:15 p.m. on a Tuesday night. Wes, who, as of my last check-in communication 4 days ago, was still at the station. Wes, who has no reason to be in Asheville. Wes, who would not stand in a parking lot and call up to a 3rd floor window under any circumstance I could imagine. Because Wes does not do things that don't have a purpose, and this would have no purpose. I counted. I got to 60. The voice had spoken twice in that 60 seconds, using his name, Wes's voice, patient and flat and waiting. At 61 seconds, I got up from the table. I went to the window. I did not open it further. I reached over and closed it. The latch caught with a small metallic click. I went back to the table and sat down. I have not opened the window since. I tell myself I'll open it when it gets too hot. That night, I went back to the survey report and read the same paragraph 4 times before I gave up and made new coffee and sat with it until the sky started to lighten in the east. The parking lot was empty. I know because I checked the camera feed on my phone. My building has parking lot cameras accessible through a tenant app. I checked at 61 seconds, and at 90 seconds, and at 3 minutes. The lot was empty all 3 times. No figure. No one standing below my window, calling up at 11 p.m. I don't know whether whatever is on Noland Divide has followed me, or whether it was always this range, and I only became aware of it when the rules taught me how to listen. I don't know whether the location was ever the container, or whether I carried something out of it in the specific neural configurations that 5 days of maximum attention to its behavioral patterns might produce. I don't know what minute 6 is. I have 6 weeks of not knowing, and I have been sitting with it in the patient, disciplined way of someone who was trained to sit with evidence until the evidence speaks. The evidence is not speaking yet. I don't know what's on Noland Divide. I want to be honest about that. I have given you 40 years of documentation and 5 days of personal testimony and a lot of careful, professional observation. And none of it adds up to a name or a category or a complete description of what is there. The park's incident reports don't name it. The logs don't name it. Wes, who has 15 years on that ridge, calls it nothing, names it nothing, works around it with the precise respect of a man who has learned that the most dangerous thing is to assume you understand something you don't. What I can tell you is that the rules work. Every one of them. I am alive and present and in possession of all the cognitive and physical faculties I came in with, because I counted to 60. I checked campsites in the correct sequence. I sat down in the fog. I wrote rather than spoke. I neither confirmed nor denied. I stayed quiet in the quiet zone. And I went inside at minute 5 and did not come out again. Hendrix went out. Hendrix knew the rule. Hendrix was a careful, experienced, intelligent ranger who understood what the rule was for, and went out anyway because he decided that some rules are wrong. And the thing in his notebook, the handwriting that belongs to no hand I found in 40 years of logs, sent back the message that he found something, and that what he found was finding me too. The 5 minutes were never the point. I think about that sentence more than any of the others. I have been in the rules for 6 weeks, and I still don't know what the point is. I have been following them in my kitchen, and in my parking lot, and in my grocery store, instinctively, without deciding to. And something spoke from my parking lot 2 nights ago, in a voice it should not have had. And I counted, and I stayed inside. And I don't know yet whether that is the end of something or the beginning. If you are ever in the Smokies, on the north side of the park, on a trail that comes up from Bryson City and climbs a long, narrow ridge and gets quiet in the middle in a way that doesn't feel like the normal quiet of trees. If the fog starts moving east, if someone calls your name from below the ridgeline, if you find yourself at a campsite and your count keeps changing, listen to me. Carry these. 1. If you hear your name spoken from below the ridgeline, do not respond. Do not turn toward the sound. Walk at your established pace for 60 seconds before you do anything else. Count every second. 2. Check campsite 67 last, and regardless of trail efficiency, regardless of weather, last. 3. If the fog moves east, stop. Sit down on the trail. Do not use any electronic device. Wait until it turns back, or until you can see 15 feet of trail in both directions. 4. Do not count the register at campsite 54 aloud. Write the number. Do not speak it. If it doesn't match, return to station in person. Do not use the radio. 5. If a hiker tells you they saw a ranger ahead of you on the trail, note the description. Do not confirm. Do not deny. Complete your check-in. 6. In the quiet zone, speak only to hikers who speak first. Do not initiate. Do not raise your voice. If you need to communicate urgently, write it down. 7. At the end of every patrol, sit outside the station door for 5 minutes. Listen to the Noland Creekside. If you hear anything, you cannot name anything at all. Go inside. Sign the log. Do not come back out until morning, regardless of what you hear, regardless of what it sounds like, regardless of who it sounds like. Stay inside. I've been following Rule 7 for 6 weeks now, 12 miles from the park boundary, on the 3rd floor of a building with a parking lot camera. And the voice is getting closer, and I am still counting. I don't know what happens at minute 6. I'm trying very hard not to find out.